It was 1943, the year the promise of precision daylight bombing ran into reality. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched shining streams of B-17s and B-24s across the North Sea, climbing into the cold, thin altitudes where propellers sliced the air into a white haze of contrails. The theory said box formations and .50 caliber machine guns would protect them. The reality said otherwise. Because once those bombers left the coast of England, they outflew their guardians. P-47 Thunderbolts were killers close to home, but their range line ended roughly where the real danger began. P-38 Lightnings could go farther, but winter exposed their own demons. Cold cockpits, temperamental engines, maintenance stretched thin at high altitude. The Luftwaffe watched the Escorts peel away. Then it climbed into the gap. Over Regensburg and Schweinfurt, over factories that made the metal bones of modern war, German fighters swarmed the empty air around the bomber stream. They hit head-on, dove from above, slid up from below, and when ammunition was gone they landed, rearmed, and returned to carve more holes in the formation. 60 bombers lost in a single day at Schweinfurt, 600 airmen missing in one mission. No strategy can survive a calendar full of days like that. The air war over Europe hinged on a single word: time. Who would own the minutes when the bombers needed them most? The answer didn't look like a miracle. It looked like two teardrops hanging from a fighter's wings, clumsy, forgettable, and to German eyes hilarious. They were not shiny aluminum. They were not permanent. They were made of paper. Britain had built them first. Laminated craft shells soaked in resin, pressed in molds, fitted with a metal filler neck, a vent, and a simple feed line. They were single-use, cheap, fast to build in factories that didn't make airplanes. Fill them with fuel, hang them under the wings, burn them first, and throw them away before you fought. It sounded like wartime desperation. It turned out to be exactly what the war required. The airplane that would make those tanks matter arrived with an entirely different kind of elegance. The P-51 Mustang began as a British request and became an American obsession. Its laminar flow wing cut drag. Its clean fuselage turned fuel into miles. And when a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin slid into its nose, the Mustang learned to breathe thin air like it was born there. It could finally escort deep, if you fed it enough fuel. Inside, the Mustang carried plenty: wing tanks and, in later versions, an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot. But the internal fuel alone still left a hole on the map. Targets the Mustang could reach but not guard. Fights it could win but not stay for. Two external tanks closed that hole. Hang a pair of 108-gallon paper tanks under the wings and the numbers changed. Nearly 500 gallons total. At high altitude, with patient hands on throttle and mixture, that turned into more than 1,000 miles of range with combat time to spare. German pilots saw those tanks and scoffed. They called them Papierbehälter, paper containers, and joked that one bullet would turn a Mustang into a comet. They had reasons to be confident. Every external tank, metal or paper, carried risks. Some leaked, vents iced. A few stuck on the pylon at the worst moment, but the point wasn't perfection. The point was scale. Could the Allies hang tens of thousands of these under fighters, and, by doing so, flood the air battle with minutes the Luftwaffe couldn't match? At the start of 1944, a new commander answered that question with doctrine instead of doubt. James "Jimmy" Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force and uttered a sentence that felt like heresy to some and freedom to others. The fighter's job was not merely to guard the bombers. The fighter's job was to destroy the German Air Force. That order unlocked the purpose of those ridiculous tanks. They weren't just extra fuel. They were extra options. With externals feeding the Merlin, a Mustang could leave the bomber stream, race ahead, and hit interceptors while they formed. It could loiter near airfields and watch the traffic pattern like a hawk. It could stay through the target run and still have the gas to shepherd stragglers home. When it came time to fight, one call turned patience into speed. Tanks away. A Mustang with tanks is a fast commuter. A Mustang without them is a knife. The jettison hook snapped, the teardrops tumbled, drag vanished, and the airplane surged. German pilots who had trained to exploit the escorts turned back point found no such point anymore. The enemy was early. The enemy stayed late. The enemy chose the fight. February brought a test. Operation Argument, Big Week. 6 days of pounding aircraft plants and the arteries that fed them. In previous months, raids of this depth would have bled out on the way in and died on the way home. Now, P-51s with externals escorted all the way, and more importantly, hunted all the way. Luftwaffe units climbed to meet bomber streams that already had fighters above them, in front of them, and at their sides. The clashes were savage. The rhythm changed. Veteran leaders fell. Replacement pilots looked up from briefings and realized the clock that once worked in their favor now worked against them. And then the mission that had once sounded like madness became a line on the board. Berlin. Before the spring of 1944, the German capital was a place daylight bombers could reach but not keep. That sky belonged to defenses that massed in predictable layers. The price of staying was too high. The price of turning back was too obvious to ignore. With the Mustang and its strange luggage, the calculus shifted. On March 6th, formations of B-17s and B-24s rose into a sky banded with cloud. Their escorts climbed with them, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and Mustangs wearing tanks like a promise. Over the North Sea, pilots leaned their mixtures, checked their balances, and switched to externals. The Marion blue of the radios filled with simple check-ins. The hours ticked. And at the edge of the city's defenses, when controllers reported plots thickening and contrails weaving, dozens of pilots across the formation made the same decision. Tanks away. For the men in Luftwaffe cockpits, the first shock was timing. Escorts were already there. They dove through forming staffhelm, then climbed, circled, and hit again. They met the defenders over the target, and when the bomber stream turned for home, they were still around to slash at predators sniffing for stragglers. The paper tanks German pilots had mocked had already done their work. They had bought the minutes that decided the fight. The technology behind those minutes was simple and stubborn. Each tank was layers of resin-impregnated paper pressed into a rigid shell, a metal neck set at the top for the filler, a vent line to keep the feed smooth, and a connection to the pylon that could be cut with one command. They were never meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be plentiful. Crews fueled them late to keep the seams from soaking up rain. They used them first. They marked them left and right to keep the airplane balanced as the levels fell. When something went wrong, a vent froze, a tank hiccuped, pilots learned to nurse it. When a tank refused to leave the wing, they learned a diver's trick. Load the airplane, pull hard, and hope the sudden G-force shook the clamps free. It wasn't glamorous. It was routine, and routine wins wars. There was a catch inside the Mustang itself, a quirk every pilot knew. The 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the cockpit. Filled, it shifted the center of gravity aft. The airplane wandered in hard turns, felt twitchy at the edge of the stall, punished pilots who yanked it around. The fix was discipline. Burn that tank early in enemy territory. Do not dogfight with more than a few gallons left behind the seat. Use it for crossing water. Use it for climbing in safety. Then make the airplane honest again before the merge. With that discipline, a P-51 became two machines in one day. In the morning, an airline with guns, legs long enough to stride across a continent. In the afternoon, a knife that leapt forward the instant its pilot rid himself of the drag he no longer needed. German squadrons tried to adapt. They hurled themselves head-on, where closing speeds compressed the window for an escort to interfere. They climbed in spirals, tried to arrive from above at the last second. They hid in clouds and came out like sharks. They got kills, many of them. But no tactic holds forever when the enemy has time to meet you before the first pass and time to meet you again on the last. The new rhythm echoed across concrete and grass. Airfields that had once felt safe behind flak belts became hunting grounds. A pilot who survived a savage scramble, fired his cannon in a single pass, and broke away at full power still had to land. He did so with eyes that scanned not just for wind, cross traffic, and flak, but for the specks that meant Mustangs had waited above the circuit until the jets and pistons alike came back down to earth. The Me-262, the jet that looked like the future had arrived ahead of schedule, only sharpened the lesson. It could run from everything. It could strike like a hammer. But it drank fuel, took long minutes to spool, and always had to land somewhere. The fighter with patience, the one that could circle while flak barked and windsocks twitched, owned the moment the future touched the runway. Meanwhile, the factories behind the strange invention did the dull miracle that modern war requires. Paper mills pressed shells. Furniture plants assembled fittings. Trucks rolled in at dawn with pallets of fresh tanks. Ground crews did not hoard them. They assumed more would come tomorrow, and they were right. Aluminum and labor could go into airplanes and engines, while paper and glue went into range. The little things multiplied until they outweighed the big ones. If you want to see all of this in a single sweep, follow a day with a long-range group in the spring of 1944. Briefing before sunrise. A red string on the map runs east, farther than most of the men have flown. The weather officer talks about ice at 27,000 feet. The intelligence officer warns about squadrons that guard the capital like hornets. The operations officer repeats the rules everyone already knows. Fuel the externals late, switch to them early, balance them carefully, burn the fuselage tank down before the fight, jettison before the merge. Takeoff. Climb. Level over the sea. Silence that means everything is fine. The first contrails ahead. A calm vector from a controller who sounds bored because he's done this all week. The call, tanks away. The airplane lunges forward. A wingman glances out and sees the teardrops tumbling. The throttle moves. The nose lifts. 4 aircraft slide down sun and then arc into a climbing staffel that expected another minute. A 109 flicks its rudder too late and the sky fills with dots. The Mustangs keep going. They meet the bombers as flak begins and then break off to harass a new group climbing through a hole in the cloud. After the bombs fall, they wait on the edge of a pattern at an unfamiliar field until a fighter appears in the landing turn, and the angles tilt in their favor again. Hours later, with the coast in sight and the tanks long gone, they still have fuel to escort a straggler, to bounce 2 predators who came hunting, to bring everyone home. Wheels roll on grass. Engines pop and tick in the cool. Crew chiefs meet the airplanes with ladders, cans, and the bag of stories every debrief will turn into brief humor. Someone tosses a rag. Someone asks about the stuck tank that wouldn't let go. Everyone glances toward the truck that already carries tomorrow's replacements. Pilots wrote that the first time they jettisoned their externals they felt the wing go weightless, the airplane leap as if it had shed fear itself. They wrote that with the fuselage tank down to a splash, the Mustang became what it looked like, pure, steady, and hungry for the turn. They wrote about the moment a contrail above Berlin broke apart under their guns, and the suddenness of the understanding that had been creeping up on them all year. The sky had changed hands. German pilots wrote something else. Some remembered the shock of seeing escorts miles ahead of the bomber stream, already diving. Some remembered the helplessness of landing under watchful enemies too patient to spend themselves on the first pass. Some remembered taking comfort in whispered myths. Shoot the tanks, they'll explode. Wait for the drop, the hooks won't work, only to discover the myths didn't hold out beyond the first seconds of the fight. As the months rolled on, the strategic effect became a map. Oil refineries burned. Marshalling yards broke. Rail lines tore and stayed torn. Training hours in Germany shrank with every gallon of gasoline that never reached a flight line. The Luftwaffe still fought with brilliance and bravery. What it could not fight was arithmetic. The enemy was early. The enemy stayed late. The enemy came back tomorrow. The simplest way to measure the change is with a pair of words that traveled on the radio in calm American voices over enemy cities. tanks away. Two syllables, two clunks, two shapes tumbling into cloud. A fighter changed from a long-legged guardian into a predator. The clock slid across the table to a different pair of hands. That is what the paper in paper tanks actually bought. Not speed, not altitude, not firepower. Time. Time to choose the engagement. Time to stack fights on top of each other. Time to escort from door to door instead of to the threshold and no further. Time for a system of bombing, navigation, radar control, and pilot training to work as designed. Time for crews who had once walked to their airplanes with dread to walk with a kind of grim confidence that daylight over the capital was not suicide anymore. In the last year of the war, as jets howled and cities burned, the strangest part of this story remained the most important. The decisive tool did not look like the future. It looked like a disposable object built by people who would never see the front. It was cheap. It was ugly. It did not survive a single mission. It did not need to. The Germans laughed at them when they appeared. Americans trusted them every morning. Factories kept feeding them. And the skies over Berlin, once a sanctuary you reached only at an unacceptable cost, became a place where Mustangs circled, fought, and returned home. So when you picture that silver fighter a mile above the world, do not just see the sleek fuselage, the bubble canopy, or the yellow-tipped propeller. See the two clumsy shapes it carried across the sea. See them fall away at the edge of the fight. Hear the engine rise as the drag disappears. Feel the clock tilt. This is how a war changes, not always with a wonder weapon, not always with a brilliant theory, but with a disposable invention that buys the one thing airmen never have enough of: time. And in 1944, time belonged to the Mustang.